Hello and welcome to another episode of Parker's Previews powered by The Hammer. I'm your host, Parker, and these are my previews. This is a show where I'm going to take some data, some stats, some analytics, and provide a deeper dive into some of these interesting college football matchups of the week so that we can be better consumers of college football content and smarter investors when it comes to these games. Going to switch things up a little bit this week. I know I've been doing a single video for 3 games. And going to kind of collapse those today and put those all into one video, do a little bit of talking about teams in general and trends, and then dive into some specific matchups. Again, that's just me tweaking with the show, trying to figure out what I want it to be and how best I can communicate and kind of discuss these games in a way that's informative for all of you as well. So today we're going to talk a little bit about some expectations and reality, how some teams are doing compared to the spread over the course of the season. We're going to talk about how who's good, who's bad, who's in the Power 5, where teams kind of settling as we're getting past the halfway point of the season and we know about teams. Then we'll have 3 matchups this week with picks as well. So hope you enjoy this. Hope you're along for the ride. I'm going to show some graphs today, and if you're listening to this in audio format, know that I'm going to do my very best to describe things as well, so that you don't just need the graph. And I'm not just commenting on a picture that you see and talking about these things a little bit more, a little bit better for those of you who can't see this. But do make sure you are subscribed to the YouTube channel. Make sure that you are following Parker's Previews and me at Stats of War on Twitter as well. And thanks so much for listening. I'm excited to get into it. So let's go ahead and start with the expectations and reality graph that I really like to look at. Is just consensus spread point differential and actual point differential. So if the spread is -7, right, for all 5 of your games, your projected spread differential, kind of the expectation, a baseline expectation, is 35 points. And if you outscore your opponent by 10, your actual point differential is 50 points. And so the difference between those, I think, is a meaningful indicator of how your season is going relative to kind of where Vegas has you pegged in the market. So here on this graph, we have just our consensus point spread for all of your games, FBS versus FBS only, on the x-axis. And then on the y-axis here, we've got your actual game point differential. There's a couple of teams here that I think really stand out and they're really interesting. So your biggest overperformers are actually coming on this left side of the graph here. You've got Duke is 88 points above what the spread expected. That's most overall. Buffalo is right behind them with 82.9. And then you've got Illinois right over here is your third biggest overperformer relative to the spread at 79.5. 3 teams are in the 60s. You've got Western Kentucky's been doing pretty well. They actually were projected to do pretty well. So the difference between them and Buffalo and Duke and kind of Illinois is that, Western Kentucky is expected to outscore their opponents by 55, and they're at about 115, whereas Illinois is, within 10 points of 0 is what they were projected, and they've vastly overperformed that, up in the 60s. San Jose State has been another one that's in that group here of, their expectations weren't very high, but they've blown it absolutely out of the water. You've got Kansas who overperformed en route to a 5-0 start. Down here sticking out from the crowd. The expectations for them were super low, -55 point differential, and they're at like +15 on the season. So very good for them. TCU has done well. Tennessee, of course, just putting up so many points. Them and Southern Cal are both teams that had very high preseason expectations, 85 to 95 market expectations, I should say, not preseason, 85 to 95 points above what the market would expect. And they're both in the 140s, doing a lot better. So absolutely outscoring above that line. You do have kind of your clear consensus. I won't say playoff teams because I don't really care about the playoff. But your consensus top 4 teams. So Ohio State, Georgia, Michigan, and Alabama have all been vastly favored over their opponents. And all have performed right about where the market expected. Ohio State and Michigan have done the best. Georgia is right on line with what the market expected, about 175 points in expectation and about 185 point differential there. Alabama slightly underperforming, although their expectations were the highest. So the Vegas spread suggested that Alabama had a 250 plus point differential this season. And they've had about 205, 215. So definitely underperforming some really big expectations. Of course, in a game against A&M, a 21-point spread against Texas, that was a 1-point win. That lost to Tennessee, where they were favored by 9. Kind of shows that why they might be underneath that line. There's a couple interesting teams here if you're thinking about who might I fade. BYU and Miami both had very high preseason expectations, expected to be, 65 to 85 point differential positive on the season. They're both negative point differential on the season. Teams that have a little bit under the radar, UConn has been what I'll say normal bad compared to what you might expect to be, apocalyptically terrible, like they have been in the past. UConn's actually been pretty good. The market expected them to be in the minus 165 to minus 155 negative point differential this season, and they're actually about hovering right under 115, negative 115. And so they've definitely outkicked kind of their coverage as well. Another team that you might want to fade, Western Michigan, has been very poor despite low expectations. They were expected by the consensus spread to be about negative 25 on the season. And they're, minus 125. So absolutely outkicking a slew of teams right here is pretty informative as to how this graph helps us. That's Virginia Tech, Auburn, and Central Michigan on top of each other. 3 teams who have just vastly disappointed in big spots this season relative to expectations, but 3 teams to whom the market has caught up. So as we move from these outliers, I should point out Oklahoma got blown out in a couple games it was favored in. They're going to be trying to correct that all season. But as we're looking at who do we want to fade situationally, who do we want to invest in situationally, you want to look at these teams who have, I'm circling Texas as well. They outperformed. A lot of that was games against Oklahoma and against Alabama. But as we move out of that, you kind of get this normal cluster of teams, right, that are distributed around, with minus some outliers, there's a lot of teams who are performing pretty decently around what Vegas expected. There's a couple people outliers on both sides. You've got, your TCUs, your Nebraskas. Georgia Southern has done better than expected. Hawaii's done worse. Vanderbilt's done better. So there's some symmetry there. But generally, you have a pretty, if you sampled teams at random and just projected their points, you kind of expect it to look like this outside of those outliers. So these are key teams to look at when you're betting. Might suggest that, hey, Vegas doesn't have a good read on UConn, Kansas, Buffalo, Duke, San Jose State, Illinois, Western Kentucky, Texas, Tennessee, and USC, and maybe not a good read on the other direction on Oklahoma, BYU, and Miami, that Auburn, VT, Central Michigan cluster, Western Michigan, that kind of group as well. So it's just a good way to kind of visualize, hey, who have been the outliers in terms of what Vegas has projected and how well they have done relative to that projection. Another way that we can kind of conceptualize teams is let's look at their opponent adjusted EPA per play. This is just going to be the Power 5 teams, and we're going to have 3 Power 5 matchups this week. So I'm not intentionally excluding the G5 guys, leaving them out. But I am excited to kind of dive into these matchups and point out where they are, because I think this spatial representation is really important to understand. So what we have here is a graph that's our offensive EPA per play is on the x-axis. So the further up you go, the better offenses you are. You see USC, really good offense. Tennessee, a really good offense. Ohio State, obviously very good. Oregon, North Carolina, Washington, all these guys are here. And the red line, there's a median line. So you can see kind of who's better than average and who's worse than average. Same thing for defense on the x-axis, right? Teams over here, Iowa is going to be really good. Missouri's a good defense. Virginia's a good defense. Georgia, good defense. Michigan, the best defense in college football right now. Arizona, a very bad defense. So you kind of get a nice spatial outline. So some of the games we're going to look at today involve teams that are just on opposite sides here. So I'll highlight and circle, if I can, kind of where they are, and that might give you some reads as to why I'm picking these matchups. So the first one's pretty obvious. Michigan State, a very big rivalry game this weekend. Michigan's got the best defense overall in college football when you adjust for opponent, and they have one of the best offenses. They're about ninth in EPA per play offense when you adjust for opponent. You can see that they are firmly in the good quantile. They are, 2 standard deviations away from the mean in defensive quality, and they're about 1.5 standard deviations away from the mean in offensive quality. So very solid team. And you see that Michigan State is in the exact opposite quantile. They're just almost the exact opposite team of Michigan here. They are, excuse me, one of the 10 worst defenses in Power 5, and they are one of the 10 worst defenses in the Power 5 as well. So very bad on both sides of the ball. We'll dive into the specific matchups of that, but you can see, it makes a lot of sense that we're going to pick Michigan to cover because Michigan is solid and balanced on both sides of the ball. Michigan State is solid and imbalanced on both sides of the ball as well. The second matchup that we're going to pick this week is going to be UCLA, who's covered a little bit by TCU here. UCLA is in this category of good offense. They're one of the 15 best offenses in college football, but bad defense. They're in the bottom half of the Power 5 in defense. They're going to play Stanford this week. Stanford is going to be right next to Michigan State in that bad offense, bad defense category as well. So we can see these games, UCLA a little bit better defense than Stanford, not great. But UCLA's offense is much better than Stanford. So immediately looking at this graph, I'm saying, I like what UCLA is going to be able to do against Stanford. And I don't know that Stanford is going to be able to do the same thing back to UCLA's defense. So that's a nice matchup here. Another one that's kind of very similar, not as dramatic as the Michigan State-Michigan one, but Wake Forest, who's hiding here between Maryland and Florida State, and Louisville, are a little bit two sides of the same coin. They're very, very similar teams here. They're very close to each other on the axis of defense, right? Louisville actually slightly better than Wake Forest in opponent-adjusted defense, but Wake Forest demonstrably better in offense as well. So again, kind of a visual representation to understand that when we're trying to bet and pick who do we want to bet on, it's really nice to find teams that are in different quadrants on this graph, because that's going to give you a lot of information about how these teams might match up and the deficiencies that these teams are going through. So for instance, I'll circle, a couple more matchups. West Virginia is okay offense. They're right in the median on offense, but they're very bad defense. TCU is pretty close to the middle on defense, but they're one of the top offenses in college football as well. So that matchup suggests, I think that TCU is going to be able to outscore West Virginia. They might be a candidate that I want to take. Ohio State is playing Penn State this week, and Ohio State, almost inarguably the best team in the country, is playing Penn State down here. Penn State has been excellent at defense, almost as good as Ohio State, and much better than most teams in college football, but their defense is almost perfectly average. So their offense is almost perfectly average. So because you have kind of a best on best unit there, that one might be one you're skeptical about in terms of kind of this spatial representation. Last one I'll do, Tennessee, Kentucky is very similar to Wake Forest and Louisville. Tennessee, the second best offense in the nation. Kentucky, maybe the 10th best defense. But both teams are, Tennessee's a little down on defense relative to Kentucky, and Kentucky is a little down on offense relative to Tennessee. So how do we expect those to play out? We'd have to look and dive into matchups, but here we can kind of get this spatial representation, understand, if one team's in one quadrant, one team's in another quadrant, that leads me to believe that this might be a good bet. All right, long-winded way, kind of looking at a survey there. Let's go ahead and dive into some of these matchups as well. If you want to play with this graph, this is on my Twitter at StatsTheWar. You can scroll back. All my previews are up there as well, and look at it as well. The first matchup I'm going to look at this week is Stanford versus UCLA. So Stanford going to UCLA. UCLA coming off of a really rough loss at Oregon. UCLA did not punt. They didn't punt against Oregon. They averaged 4.29 points per drive against Oregon. They lost to Oregon by 15. So 1, their defense has some issues. 2, they kicked field goals. 3, they threw 1 interception. And then 4, Oregon, with an onside kick, stole a possession and was able to distance themselves pretty well. So I think UCLA is getting a little underrated in this spot. If you see where they are in terms of, you see this is like 16.5, 15.5. Stanford is not a very good team, and UCLA perhaps getting a little bit of a letdown after a big game there, a little bit a perceived letdown. So I see this as Stanford or UCLA minus 16.5, minus 17 in some places, but you shouldn't have to pay. Yeah, a couple places you can get 16.5 without any juice. You don't have to pay for those extra points. That's going to be my first official play this week is UCLA minus 16.5. I think the reason here is kind of twofold. Big picture, and then we'll dive into the stats very briefly. UCLA is really good with Chip Kelly at these kind of short intermediate passes. Dorian Thompson-Robinson has an average depth of target of like less than 6. And Stanford's offense or defense is very bad at tackling. I think that's going to put a lot of players for UCLA in good positions to break off explosive plays. I think they'll be able to move the ball. Stanford has been very bad in the red zone and in finishing quality possessions on defense, which was UCLA's issue. But Stanford is 95th in points per quality drive, whereas UCLA is 36th. So UCLA should be able to finish drives, no problem. I think that Chip Kelly could call his shot here is how many points he wants to score. The reason that you might bet Stanford is the other side of the ball, right? You might want to think, could Stanford's offense move the ball against UCLA's defense? Well, Stanford throwing a lot more than they're passing, but their passing is not that good. 70th in EPA per pass, 93rd in rushing. Their rush rate over expected is 21st. So they're putting the ball in the air. A lot of that is game state. A lot of that is just they have to make something happen and they can't move the ball very well. They are 80th in early downs EPA, so they're getting behind the chains very often, and they're only 59th in third and fourth down success. I think it's a really indicting stat that 70.2% of their first downs come on first and second downs, but they're 80th in early downs EPA. What that tells me is they're just not getting a lot of first downs, right? They're not very efficient overall. They're decently okay at finishing field position, finishing drives with 55th in points per echo. But they're 131st in starting field position compared to UCLA's 18th. So what I see from the Stanford offense versus UCLA defense matchup is a UCLA defense that's had some trouble against the pass, a Stanford offense that can't pass very well at all, and a Stanford offense who's very, very bad on early downs. UCLA has gotten burned on third and fourth downs a lot. You see this, they're 114th, allowing 48.4% of their opponent of success rate on third and fourth downs for opponents. But Stanford, I don't know, will be able to complete those. I think those will be a lot. They won't be third and manageable. They'll be third and long. That'll favor UCLA's defense. And Stanford really hasn't been good at kind of finishing drives there. So this is a situation where I'm expecting a boat race. Stanford with a really fluky win against Arizona State last week. And UCLA, a very, very good offense who's perhaps underrated because last week they did lose a game by 15, but they still averaged 4.28 points per drive. So a get-right game for the UCLA defense to kind of figure out what they want to be this season, and a pretty dang good UCLA offense to take over here as well. The next matchup I want to look at, so that one was, remember, Stanford was down in our left quadrant, UCLA was in our top left quadrant. So we have bad defense, bad offense, Stanford versus bad defense, good offense, UCLA. I'm going to lean towards UCLA in that spot. The next matchup that we have is Wake Forest versus Louisville. These teams are actually very similar, as our graph showed, about the same on defense, without adjusting for opponent. 40th in defense for Wake Forest and 37th on defense for Louisville. So very similar teams, but their offenses are just absolutely different. 97th in EPA per play for Louisville's offense, 29th for Wake Forest's defense or offense. So the tale of two teams that really aren't good, really are okay on defense, but a vast difference between their offensive abilities here. Louisville is averaging negative 0.05 EPA per play. So every time they run a snap, their expected point value goes down. That's not great. That's not what you want. Wake Forest, on the other hand, positive 0.128. They're absolutely moving the ball through the air. Sam Hartman, great story that he's back and healthy. Looks to be great. A.T. Perry is such an electric wide receiver that if they can just get the ball to him, he's going to score. But if they can't, they have 4 or 5 secondary options. I think their multiplicity is really, really going to help. They're one of the best teams in the nation at finishing drives, 5.64 points per echo, compared with the 44th best echo rate. They're generating quality possessions well, but they're also still generating some big play touchdowns. So a lot of explosiveness in this offense, 11th in EPA per pass. Louisville's defense, 44th in EPA per pass, 46th in EPA per rush. But I think this passing defense is really going to get tested. Wake Forest is 49th in rush rate over expected, minus 2.3, whereas Louisville has been a lot slower, has played a lot slower games, and benefited when teams have run more here. Going to play a lot more plays, going to have a lot more dramatic differences between these two teams. And I think that what we're going to see here is that Wake Forest's offense is going to be able to score more against Louisville's defense than Louisville's offense can muster. Louisville has some high variance on offense. You can see that they're 94th in success rate, but 97th in EPA per play. A lot of that is just negative plays. They've been able to generate a couple big plays. Malik Cunningham is a fun and interesting player, but the variance, the high volatility is almost all negative for them. They're getting weighed down by a lack of explosiveness and some negative plays. They're 94th in quality possession rate. They can't generate quality possessions very well at all. And again, it's not like one side of the ball. Oh, that's a terrible shape. It's not like one side of the ball is worse than the other in terms of early and late downs. They're 81st on early downs EPA, 84th on third and fourth down success. Wake Forest defense, for all its troubles, has been very good on early downs. 33rd in early downs EPA. They've been 85th on third and fourth downs. But if they're, pretty good against a team that isn't very good on early downs, those late downs are going to be a lot more favorable situations for Wake Forest. So again, that only leans towards Wake Forest being able to take a stand. I think Wake Forest is getting hot at the right time. And if you see this one anywhere from, I think this opened at, let me get this line up so I say this correctly. This opened at -6.5 for Wake Forest, which is a little much for me. It's currently at 3.5. You can get it 3.5. You can get it 4 for the same price. So I certainly wouldn't pay to get it. So I certainly wouldn't pay to get it to 3.5. I think there's places you can do pretty well there. I think Wake Forest could win this by a touchdown pretty easily. Could win this by 2 field goals, and so I like this spot of 3.5 rather for them, just because their explosiveness is so high. I know the total is 62. I really think that Wake Forest could break 30 and just leave Louisville in the dust here. So gonna go with that for my second play here. Wake Forest -4 or -3.5, depending on where you can get it. Obviously, all the better to get it at 3.5 than 4. So going with the favorite again here. Going to go with one last favorite this week. We're going to talk Michigan State, the rivalry. If you look at this line, it's moved since I started this video. It started at Michigan -14.5, which I really liked. It's now up to Michigan -22.5. You can get that for -110. Don't pay. It's -23 a couple of places, but you can still get it at -110. So you don't need to pay to get that from 23 to 22.5. This is about as one-sided a matchup as we're going to see all season. I'll go back to the EPA graph again. Michigan is all the way to the far right. They're the best opponent-adjusted defense in the nation and one of the top 10 opponent-adjusted offenses in the nation, whereas Michigan State is the bottom 15 of offense and defense. So not great at all for them there. We're looking at this matchup. Michigan is third in unadjusted EPA per play margin. Michigan State is 110th, 93rd on offense for Michigan State, 4th on defense for Michigan, 12th on offense for Michigan, 103rd for defense for Michigan State. So what we have here looking at these stats is a story of two teams. One is, playing really well, has kind of the top of their development cycle. And one of them lost, Kenneth Walker last year and really doesn't have much besides Jaden Reed on offense. And even that is not going well. So when Michigan State has the ball, they're having to pass a lot, but they're passing 56th overall in passing EPA, 128th in rushing EPA. So when they do run the ball, they're getting behind the chains. You can see that Michigan State is 95th in the nation this season. 95th in the nation this season on early downs EPA. That is just absolutely absurd. And they really are behind the sticks. They don't get first downs on first and second down very often at all. They're often getting into third down situations. That's going to be a problem because Michigan is 6th in third and fourth down success allowed. So there's not any way that Michigan State is really going to move the ball against this Michigan team that's been very balanced on defense as well. We've seen what Michigan can do, for instance, to a Sean Clifford, Parker Washington duo at Penn State. We've seen how they can dispose of that. I don't even know that Michigan State has something in that same universe as a threat as well. Another stat before I talk about Michigan's offense, another stat that's really important, I think, Michigan is first in echo ratio, game control. Michigan State is 96th. So even in games that Michigan State has won, they're still not controlling the ball very well. And they're allowing a lot of the game to be dictated by their opponents. For a team like Michigan who wants to get up and wants to ride this out and just kind of vice grip you, I think that's really important. There's two kind of non-football things that I think are not non-statistical things I think are important to the spot as well. One of those is certainly a revenge spot from last year where Michigan lost a game that probably ended up keeping them out of getting Cincinnati in the first round of the playoff. And I know they're probably annoyed about that. And so there's definitely a revenge spot here for Harbaugh. And second, I think that there is some very clear calculus about the landscape of college football this year and how teams are looking in the Pac-12, how teams are looking in the SEC, how teams are looking in the Big 12. And there's a pretty clear recipe for what a Big 10 team needs to do to make sure they get in the playoff if they don't get to the Big 10 championship. So big wins are going to matter, for whatever that's worth. I think Michigan is going to be able to take care of this Michigan State team. One big difference from this year's Michigan team compared to last year's Michigan team is they're 17th in EPA per pass. They really have a passing game that's more than, can we just get a big play every now and then to survive? They are third in passing success rate, 17th in EPA per pass. Michigan State's secondary has been and will continue to be terrible under Mel Tucker. They're 115th in EPA per pass allowed. Michigan is rushing a whole lot, and Michigan State's a little bit better against the rush, but they're still 67th compared to Michigan being at 13th. So I think Michigan's going to rush a lot and really press Michigan State's run defense. And as soon as Michigan State's run defense falls apart, they're going to attack the secondary, and they can credibly do it. J.J. McCarthy is 9.2 yards per target, air yards per target. So a really good kind of downfield stretch there. They're moving the ball explosively to a lot of weapons. They're getting a quality possession on 72.3% of drives, which is fourth in the nation. And really good is their starting field position is 33.6. That's sixth best in the nation. So special teams and defense is going to set Michigan's team up well to really exploit this very thin Michigan State defense. I don't think there's any reason to think that Michigan will take its foot off the gas at any point here. If you can get this at 22.5, all the better than 23. And a really good spot, I think, for Michigan here at home to take care of a pretty poor and a pretty flawed Michigan State team. All right, a quick little recap. So I'm going Michigan State minus 22, or excuse me, say that correctly. Michigan minus 22.5. I'm going Wake Forest minus 3.5. And I'm going to go with UCLA minus 16.5. Those are my three bets for this week. I think all three of those are fun, even if they are all favorites. I'm okay with riding with the favorites this week. I think this format was a little bit more fun. I get to talk about the betting stuff at the beginning and kind of who's performing well, who's underperforming, and can explore a little bit more on that. Would love to hear your feedback on Twitter in the comments. Let me know, what do you like? And we can kind of talk about how to grow this show and make it a better way for all of us to consume college football content. This has been Parker's Previews. Thanks so much for listening along. Make sure you follow on YouTube, follow on Twitter, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts for the audio version. Best of luck. Hope all of your bets cash this weekend.